All right, I only have a mic over here. I'm not wearing a mic right now. All right, well, hopefully everybody's coffeeed up, ready for the second chunk of the day, which will take us through three sessions, and then we'll go on to lunch. But let me introduce our next session. So the session is called, hold on a second, let me just move the slide. Back it up one. There you go. The session is called Building Trust in Advertising Through Quality and Transparency. And we're going to have two great speakers having a conversation today, Mr. Mike Zaneis and Mr. Tim Cadogan. Mike Zaneis is the president and CEO of TAG, formerly our industry's chief lobbyist and friend to everybody in the industry, so we should all be happy and thank Mike. And Tim Cadogan is the Chief Executive Officer of OpenX, the world's leading digital and mobile advertising technology provider. OpenX is one of the oldest and most important businesses in that network space. And so, gentlemen, please come on up.
Fair. Tim has longer legs than I do to get up here.
We're going to move these a bit closer because it looks like we don't like each other.
Yeah.
We do.
The fireplace isn't that big,
it is
so
the fireplace.
We're going to have our fireside chat a little bit closer to each other.
Morning, everybody. All right. That's an active audience.
It's good. It's good. And everybody came back from the coffee break, so that's fantastic. I was really excited to do this today. I was doing a little bit of research, and I found out that it was National Innovation Day. I don't know how many people knew that. It's probably not the biggest thing in our industry anymore because we have people such as Tim that are innovating every day. But I thought it was particularly appropriate for somebody who's been pushing things, new technologies, new approaches in business models for some time, such as programmatic, which is what we're really here to talk about today. So I'm just curious about how, what are we talking about when we say programmatic, and how has that been such a big innovation in the business model, specifically for the sell side, I think?
Yeah, so we're obviously going to talk a lot about quality and trust, but I think it's important to understand why we're even talking about it, right? And why is programmatic important? It is a very scalable way of buying an audience with atomic precision, right? And as we think about the future of media and the future of advertising, which monetizes most of the media models around the world and will continue to do so, it's very hard to see a path where you do not use technology to power that advertising. And programmatic is that technology. It enables a buyer to inspect an audience in real time and buy the segments of the individual moments of that audience that they value. And it enables a seller over time to drive competition for their audience, and with a good liquid marketplace to drive as much yield as they possibly can from quality advertisers. So the reason that I think it's important that we've been investing so much in the quality and trust side of things is not because the industry is big right now. It is because the industry could be huge over the next few years as more and more consumers go to digital screens for their entertainment, their communication. And we think that programmatic is going to probably be the default transaction system for those media experiences. Not the only, but the default because of its inherent scalability. And so that's why we think it's important. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly creating efficiencies in the marketplace around programmatic as a kind of a technology platform, if you will. So you've talked about the long-term growth potential as programmatic becoming kind of the standard buying model. It's already $45 billion in ad spend going through programmatic channels. But we've heard in the marketplace stories about CMOs especially having questions or concerns around programmatic. What are some of those concerns?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a function of success. A few years ago, not many CMOs were too focused on it because it wasn't big enough. Now it's become big enough, and it's clearer that if done right, it is going to be a fundamental building block to buy audiences in these new screen experiences. For example, TV, as you go to more digital TV, it's pretty likely that's going to be sold through a technology-based approach. So why is it becoming more of a concern? First, it's bigger, so it's just raising more attention. And second, it's not optimized, right? There are a bunch of problems with the way that programmatic works today. Most notably, the supply chain that programmatic goes through is complicated, rapidly changing, and has some kinks, to put it mildly, right? There's quality concerns, there's opacity, which reduce trust, and there have been a number of cases of people taking advantage of that system and defrauding buyers and sellers. And so when any of those come up and people become aware of those, they rightly become concerned and they say, wow, there's this new way of buying and selling. The logic makes sense, but in practice right now, it's raising concerns and fears, and I'm not sure how to address those. I'm not sure how, as a marketer, I can navigate that with comfort and be able to make sure that my spend, either on behalf of myself as the advertiser or if I'm an agency on behalf of my clients, that I can assure myself or my clients that this is working well. And so I have a lot of questions, and I want to drive to ground truth on those questions.
And the question of opacity in the supply chain, I mean, I think we all know that it's an incredibly complex industry.
Yeah.
For marketers, I always say then CMOs are not necessarily a homogeneous population because they're doing very different things. They're businesses, they're selling widgets of all different sorts or different types of services, so they don't necessarily have that unifying factor. So they're pulled in a lot of directions. How, as an industry, do we help them focus on the solutions of programmatic, and specifically what are some of their concerns around transparency and gaining more insight into how the supply chain works?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to do a better job of explaining the fundamentals, which is, yes, you can make it very complicated, or you can actually make it kind of simple, which is, if let's say you're an advertiser and you're working with an agency, you need to pick 2 or 3 DSPs, seems to be about the right number. You don't want to have one, you want to have a couple and maybe explore a third or a fourth. And you need to pick them, and you need to identify a clear set of standards and policies that you can then verify and judge those partners by. And then similarly on the supply side, you need to pick a smaller number of exchanges and say, hey, I'm going to work with a defined set of preferred DSP partners, a defined set of exchange partners in order to get to my publishers. Now, of course, you're also going to be buying directly for certain kinds of campaigns, and that totally makes sense as it continues to be an important part of the business. But when you're buying programmatically, you're buying through 2 sets of technology intermediaries, the demand side and the supply side. And so and we'll get to how do you pick those partners, but I think part of it is it actually doesn't have to be that complicated. There are 2 steps: demand side partners, SSPs or exchanges, pick a small set, define the parameters upon which you're going to select them, and we'll talk about that in a second, and then hold them to account. Verify that, hold them to account, and also, and we'll also talk about this a little bit, stick to that yourself as well. If you're a buyer, there is always a temptation to have some policies but continue to buy and look at your performance metrics, for example, to allow you to know whether something's working or not. And sometimes performance metrics don't tell the whole story of the full cost of running, for example, through tier 2 or tier 3 supply sources. Right? So you may want to really stick to, hey, these are the guardrails. P&G is a great example, right? They're saying only going to buy through tag certified channels. Boom. Like, that's the way you make it simple, you make it clear, you make it verifiable, and you start to cut out a lot of the cruft around the edges.
So it has to be simple, I think, for CMOs to understand how to build transparency in those smaller partners, as you've recommended. Yep. Are there specific ways to both identify trusted partners, but then also, we're having a great discussion in the back of the room. We should have turned on the mics and started a pre-session. But what are some of the mechanisms for buyers to be able to incorporate, really nuts and bolts, incorporate these changes so that they are effectuated in their actual relationships and buys? Yeah.
So by the way, we put a little document out from all of your chairs, and there's a lot in there. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it does provide, I think, one of the first very clear checklists or roadmap, that one, for a bunch of things that as a buyer you can do to control your spend and make sure it's done in a high quality way. But let's pick on a couple one. Transparency. So you want to know what your DSP is charging you. You're using them as a technology provider. You want to have a very clear agreement with them. With your exchanges, you want to know what is the business model of the exchange. There's been a lot of heat recently about what's called buyer fees, which is some exchanges were charging without necessarily fully disclosing it, not only a fee to the seller, which is the normal exchange model, but also a fee often variable to the buyer. Not great, right? You obviously want to make sure that you understand the business model of your partners throughout the supply chain. So with the exchanges, hold them to account for having a single fee to sellers, boom, done. And you can put this in your agreements. Second thing, on the business model side, look to avoid any kind of rebate structure. Some exchanges offer rebates to sellers to try and get more spend their way. That's not a great structure. As an industry, we've seen that rebates kind of lead us down a path that we don't really want to go down. Again, and not a great example of transparency. So a couple of examples of things that you can do on the economic and business model side of things. Then shift to quality and the quality of the inventory. One very clear thing, and I'm not just going to say this because Mike's here, but TAG has put together a great approach to verifying that suppliers are holding themselves to high standards. There are 4 areas: fraud, piracy, malware, and inventory quality. Only buy through channels that have adopted those standards, have been certified, and ideally have been independently verified. Why wouldn't you, right? Like and I think we'll hopefully see data soon that proves that what is logically true, that when you buy through those channels, you're going to have a much higher quality experience. So that would be a second big example. Third one is ads.txt. Are you guys familiar with ads.txt? Would it be worth just a... So what it is a very simple standard that the IAB put out in either late May or early June that says, hey, if you're a seller, put a little file, an ads.txt file, comes the same concept as a robots.txt file, and in that list out who you have authorized to sell your inventory, your legitimized resellers. And if someone is in that list, they're kosher. If someone's not, you haven't got to deal with them. And so as buyers, and I know a lot of people in the room as buyers are buyers, you guys can help enormously by adopting that as a policy standard for your buying. Because if you don't, what it does is it provides oxygen to unauthorized resellers, and at the gray edge of that, to counterfeiters, right? To people who take inventory and either resell it without authorization or represent it as inventory that it is not, right? Which clearly is not a good thing for a buyer, not a good thing for the real seller, and not a good thing for our industry. So to me, the really good thing is that in the last year and a half, particularly in the last, during calendar year 2017, we've seen these third-party standards come out that are giving us, true north for what is right and how we sort of strip out the ambiguity and the questions and just follow these policies. And you can probably touch a little bit. It might be worth talking on your point of view of TAG, but it's making it simpler and it's making it objective. And so if you think, first area I talked about was business models, things you can do there. Then on quality, there's things you can do there. And on ads.txt, touches on quality, touches on legitimacy, really helps anyone who's buying navigate the landscape with more certainty, which is, I think, what we're all looking for in order to get to that bigger future.
I learned early in my career that if one of your clients, one of your partners is doing a better job selling your product than you can, to just be quiet. So that's why I was quiet over here. I think the key is solutions have to be straightforward and understandable for the buy side. I think that's why ads.txt is kind of brilliant in its simplicity. It's very easy for publishers to implement, and it's easy, I think, for buyers to understand and to simply say, as you mentioned, in their contracts or MSAs, things like that, IOs to the extent that they still exist, to just ask for these things. Are you tag certified?
Insist on them.
Insist on them. That's exactly right.
Right.
That's the Mark Pritchard model of insisting on it with all your partners. So I think that's great. So we've talked a lot about buy side, and I think we've distilled some very easy to understand and action steps for them.
Yeah.
Let's flip this a little bit over to the sell side, because programmatic obviously is becoming kind of a driving force for publishers, and I'm curious how it helps publishers reach scale and efficiencies as well to meet up with the marketers.
Yeah. So. It's evolved quickly. I'd say I'm generalizing a little bit, but for a lot of publishers, it's probably a little bit north of 50% of revenue at this point. Some more, some less. It does vary. So it's become mainstream, and I think it's taken some time for people to get their arms around how to use it in a way that advantages them. I think in the early days there was a lot of concern that it would drive prices down. I think the reality is when you use an auction mechanism effectively, it drives prices up. I mean, for instance, you may have seen that Da Vinci just sold for $450 million yesterday. How was that sold? That was sold in an auction, right? The reason the most valuable items on earth are sold in an auction is when they're structured correctly, they drive prices up. Now, there's a key point in my sentence there, structured correctly. So as a publisher, I think we've gotten a lot more sophisticated about using floor pricing, about understanding what inventory to flow into the programmatic market and how to do that. And so it's begun to be a really, really important part of their business. And that needs to continue. I think it has come with some of these downsides as well, which we've been talking about, in that initially, or I'd say in the last 3 years, a lot of pubs have said, hey, if I work with one exchange, it's good, 2 is better, 3 is better. And it sort of went on to I'm going to sort of work with everybody. And on the face of it, initially, that seemed to work well. It drove a little bit of extra revenues you added each one, as though there was a diminishing return there. But over time, it's become clearer that that probably is not optimal. And what that's doing is creating that supply chain murkiness. It's creating complexity. It's making it very difficult to trust and verify all of those partners. And so what we're starting to see is something similar to what we're talking about on the buy side, is picking your spots, right? Picking not one exchange, not one programmatic partner, but a smaller number. We think probably somewhere less than 5 is about the right number. And that allows you to keep everybody honest, but also allows you to go deep, allows you to push people on these standards, and to ensure that your inventory and your audience, which as a publisher is what you've poured blood, sweat, and toil into creating, is being represented and monetized to the levels that you would expect. And so, for our part, that's certainly what we're trying to do, and still more work to be done. But a lot of our work, for instance, we're one of the first companies to be certified and independently verified for all 4 tag standards, maybe the first. A lot of the reason we're doing that is we want the publisher's supply that we help represent to receive top dollar. That's our incentive, right? And so we're trying to make our part of the supply chain as clear and clean as we possibly can. And so I think that's what's driving publishers are seeing that. For example, ads.txt has seen very, very rapid adoption. 40% of ComScore 100 pubs are already using it. That has doubled in less than 8 weeks, which I think is probably the fastest adoption of any industry standard that I can recall, and probably having been at the IB, you saw, usually it's damn hard to get these things adopted, and it's kind of going through mud and sludge. Right. This one's just on fire. And the reason is there's this need to clarify the supply chain and be able to validate quality. So longer answer, but I think that is what's going on.
Well, and you only reach that scale having a partnership between publishers and their exchange partners, for example, to help educate them, especially the small and medium-sized publishers, about what this is and why it's beneficial to them.
Yep.
And I think that ultimately leads up to, when you have things like your tag certifications, and I think independent validation is incredibly important, and you all should be commended for that. That's an industry standard we're pushing towards. But what that does is it creates value back to the marketers, which I think sometimes they forget about. Mm-hmm. Right? They so often want to stick to their key KPIs.
Yep.
but sometimes they don't necessarily quantify or take into consideration to the extent they should brand safety and the brand integrity. So I think what you're really talking about is solutions that are good for publishers to drive revenue, and then quality publishers will create better brand, not just affinity, but protection. I think we've always talked about brand affinity. Now we're talking about brand protection as a real value proposition for marketers. And so that synergy, I think, is really important. Are you seeing more of your buy-side clients thinking about this?
Yeah. So I think you outlined classic examples, second-order effects, right, or second-order costs or benefits. And yes, I mean, we are in the, again, it's really in the last year that we're seeing the buy side really drill into the nature of the supply more. So I think early on in programmatic, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the power of it is you can buy the exact audience you want in real time at a price that you set. And if you win, you win, and if not, you revisit. And that has a tremendous allure. And so it led to a very big focus on the audience, and sometimes a bit of a loss of focus in certain cases on the context or the brand or the adjacency in which that audience moment was being acquired. And I think we've certainly seen people swing back around and say, you know what, that stuff, which sometimes sounds traditional, that's really important. And it's really, really important if you sort of have a high brand, brand affect. But it's pretty much important to most advertisers. And so the buy side is now much more actively thinking about supply channel choices, which partners to buy through, winnowing that down to a preferred set of partners, and beginning to really think about some of these standards that are objective and cannot be gamed, and using those as signposts or guideposts to buy effectively in a safe way that mitigates any second order or negative second order effects and helps burnish the brand in ways that maybe are hard to measure in the near term, but are very important in the long term.
That's fantastic. One last question, then maybe we'll have a minute to take a question from the audience. So we've identified the problem, the promise of programmatic, the possible problems with its real-world solutions, but at the end of the day, how as a company or as an industry are we able to measure success in this space about protecting brand safety, fighting things like fraud and piracy and the like?
Yeah, so if you think from a publisher point of view, I used to work at Yahoo and run a bunch of the ad business. There's two things, right? It's your user experience and your user growth comes first, and your revenue, right? And you're always trying, to some extent there's a trade-off, you're balancing and optimizing and tuning those two variables and many different KPIs that sit beneath those, but those are fundamentally the drivers. From a brand or an advertiser point of view, ultimately, of course, you're trying to drive sales, right? And you're trying to drive all of the components that sit on top of sales, from awareness through to preference through to driving the actual sale. And there's you guys know much more about that than I do, since many of you live that day to day. But it's thinking about those metrics and then applying them through this new ecosystem that we're all helping to create and to evolve. And so I think it's thinking about those higher order goals, thinking about how they map to more specific metrics, the beloved KPIs, and looking at those feedback cycles. And then lastly, I'd say there's something that isn't quite so easy to measure, but is more in the realm of principles, which is how do you get comfortable that you have a trusted set of partners? And how do you pick those partners, and how do you go deep with them? And to go right back to your first point around innovation, how do you co-innovate over time? Because probably the one certainty that we all have in this room is, in another month our space will be a little different, and another month it'll be a little different. This is not a static environment. And so we have to think about navigating it together. And so when you identify kind of ground truth principles and can stick to those as things change, that helps you navigate. And so those are some of the things that we think about. And that's why I think some of these objective third-party standards are so inherently important, because things are changing so much. It's good to keep some things clear and principled. So that would be the third bucket.
It's fantastic. I'm also hopeful then as an industry we'll be able to very soon to measure all of our kind of quality control, brand safety measures that we have implemented and have some quantifiable evidence that
and
all of this hard work.
Yeah, we will receive those reflected in the ultimate business objective of the principals, which are buyers and sellers. Right?
That's right. Well, stay tuned for that kind of empirical evidence as well. Do we have time for one question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Rob. Who has a question? Somebody has to want to ask Tim something else.
Or Mike. You don't have to ask me. Does this hold, let me ask you, does this, so one of my points is an injunction to buyers to adopt these standards and to run with them, and is not only hold people like us to account, but to hold yourself to account to adopting them and to actually running a business based on them. Does that ring true? Does that make sense to people, or you think it's horseshit? Like, are you going to do that, or is it like, no, well, it sounds good, but actually we're just going to keep buying whatever works and not really think about these things?
Do we take a straw poll on it works versus horseshit?
Or, come on, let's see.
Let's just vote on horseshit.
Yeah.
Raise your hand.
There's one. Sorry?
You mentioned the word works, right? But as we all know, that you mentioned the word, is it horseshit, or are we going to just do it because it works?
Yeah.
But can you qualify the word "it works"? Because invalid traffic, as we know, doesn't work. So.
Yes. So you know, for example, you would be looking for metrics, and you could experiment with this. Here's a way to experiment with this. You could buy through tag-certified channels and non-tag certified channels, and use your third-party fraud and viewability vendors to help you measure the difference. Right? That would be a very quick, I think, and using standard technology way of identifying whether or not it led to different outcomes. In those. So that would be a great way of, our contention is that, yes, it makes a big difference. Yeah. But that would be a way for you to, and again, my point is that independently verify. Yeah. Like, don't necessarily trust people, but verify and have your own metrics to verify that. So that would be a way to test whether or not it worked.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Great hypothetical piece of research. So
isn't it?
We'll explore that further. That's fantastic, and because I think that's exactly what this area is calling for, is very simple how-to list, such as the OpenX document that they put out there. I think we have to get from the theoretical of there's a problem here, we all know that there's a problem, to next steps, action steps, very simple things that buyers and sellers can do to get to the solutions, and then we have to measure those in an independent, empirical manner. And I think we'll be back here next year or in London early next year talking more about some of those results.
Like
we're excited about
practical action. Can I just give you an example? So I used to be in the search business. I used to run Yahoo Search. And about 2005, there was a really big hullabaloo about click-through fraud, click fraud, right? Which obviously search is based on clicks, as you all know. And we and Google were on the front cover of Business Week. It was Business Week, not Bloomberg Business Week back then. And it was a big black cover, said the dark side of advertising, click fraud, and had Google and Yahoo logos on there, which is about as much heat as you can get, right? At that time, that was a really big media outlet. A lot of heat, a lot of pressure, a lot of questioning. Kind of reminded me of what we're going through right now, although it was even hotter in the kitchen then. We did a lot of things, and Google and Yahoo both did a lot of things to outline to the industry what we were doing about click fraud, all of the algorithms, the policies, exposing those, helping people understand what was going on. And through those efforts, people became comfortable with that and overcame their doubts. And we know where the paid search industry now is. Obviously, mainly it's Google, but it's gargantuan, and I don't think anyone really questions the inherent validity of that. That is exactly what we need to do for this industry, and I don't see any reason why we can't get through it. We have an increasing number of tools and methods available to us. So that's my goal. I think our goal over the next year or so is to get through that cycle, get on the other side, and allow this industry to flourish as much as it can.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks,
guys.
Cheers. Thank you. Good job, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I think we.